Welcome to the Athletic Performance Podcast, conversation for all things performance related. I'm your host, Ryan Patrick, and today we're going to do a deep dive on everything speed, power, and strength. Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoy this episode. Hi, welcome to the Athletic Performance Podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Patrick, and today's episode is called In Case You Missed It. So as you know, we are in the 17th episode of this podcast. This is very new. I am very green to this. I have been fortunate to have some amazing guests, some world-class coaches, Mike Robertson, Lee Taft, guys who are creating cutting-edge strength and conditioning equipment like the Proteus and Sam Miller. And what I want to do is go back through all of these guests that I've had and pull out what I feel like are some of the best nuggets of information from each of these interviews. I'm going to give you guys a quick intro on each one just so you kind of know what it's about. But broadly speaking, there's going to be three categories that I kind of lump together. One is going to be technology. Two is going to be program, delivery, and design. And three is going to be baseball, because I have quite a few specific baseball guys. Now, obviously, the program theory and program delivery is going to be the biggest category. This episode is for strength coaches. I'm talking to strength coaches, and we're just jamming on a lot of theory about training. And so my hope is that, one, these guests inspire you with their information to go back and listen to these episodes. I don't feel like they've got enough legs under them just because we're really starting this podcast from the ground up. And these coaches are tremendous. They're mentors. They're people I try to emulate, and they're friends. And I think that we need to give their content and their insight a lot more mileage. And so, that's really my hope with this podcast, is that we can just get more eyeballs on them, pull out what some of their best information is, and inspire you to share the episode and go back and listen to what they're providing. Now, without further ado, our very first one that I'm going to introduce is Kyle Waugh, and this is actually from episode 1. Kyle and I jam on assessing and creating interventions. Now, this was huge for me because I get very caught up in trying to have the perfect assessment, trying to understand what it means when my athlete shows up with a lack of hip internal rotation, and at the same time, figuring out how I can create interventions for them in the context of their program that don't involve them just laying on the ground all the time or doing things, mobility drills, breathing drills that I know they're going to find boring, that I know they're not going to do and put their heart into. And so we talk from a big theory perspective about coaching and about training and about creating these interventions. And I think his insight here is very valuable. And it definitely got me in a position where I needed to step back and think about how I'm coaching and communicating with my athletes when we're assessing and when we're delivering some of these interventions. So without further ado, here's the clip from Kyle Waugh.
Yeah, man. I always think of it as like, I start with the end result, right? And 9 times out of 10 for my clients and the people that I see, it's get out of some kind of pain, right? Or improve some type of mobility or whatever is just bothering them. So they have a complaint about something. So that end result, is they need to be better. They need to be better. They need to be stronger. And I want them to be as independent as possible, right? So whatever goal they have, if they want to run a marathon, they want to, roll in jiu-jitsu, whatever it is, I don't care. We're going to get you there, right? So start with the end result, and then it's just kind of been working backwards, in my opinion, right? I don't care about... I do and I don't care about the hip internal rotation or the posture or what are the problems. It's more like that out over there is 100% and we're going for that. So we know the path, we know the goalpost, let's get there. So I don't care the methodology. We can use PRI, we can use functional patterns, we can use whatever the hell it is. And in my opinion, all those things are just educational systems and acronyms and things that are used for professionals to utilize to communicate effectively. But I don't use that with my clients because, one, they don't care. Two, it just muddies the water. If anything, if I tell you have left AIC pattern and a right PC and your hip internal rotation's off and blah, 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 I'm just literally already putting up barriers to the goalpost, right? So instead, it's more, let's find this process. Let's see what's maybe potentially adding and going in this direction, but I don't want to already vocally put those in front of them, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. So that's just kind of overarching mindset that I have with this. But then the other more tactical sense is I keep it simple. It's like we got three things: how you feel, your complaint, right? What hurts, what doesn't move well, what looks weird, your posture. So like this organism, we'll say, in front of you, like what's the shape, what's maybe affecting it right now, right? We know posture is affected by a plethora of factors: stress, how you breathe, bloating, the movements you did as a kid versus what you're doing now, movements you don't do. Like there's so much kind of happening, but we know movement is a huge factor that does influence that. So kind of create a hypothesis based off of that, and then I'm looking at actual movements maybe around that area. So seeing, yeah, hey, there is a hip hike here. Cool. Don't freak out. This is nothing to be worried about, because a hip hike is a natural process that the body uses, but why is that maybe happening? Then we dive into that hip. What's the rotation look like? What's your flexion? What's your extension? Here's the range of motion. Let's look at that passively and actively. And then let's look at that in open chain, closed chain, right? Gravity affecting it, gravity not affecting it. And then at that point, you're kind of just like, all right, well, we've simplified this big time. That hip looks weird. It has shit range of motion and it hurts. Weird. Like, we know, like, let's do this. Let's see what's going to happen if we improve this, right? If you have 20 degrees out of 120 degrees, you got a lot of room to grow there, right? So that's really just kind of how it's like, we know the end goal. Here's these three little things that we're kind of controlling or using as a data set, and then we'll take that and create an intervention based off of it. So that's, I don't know, man, it's probably not very revolutionary.
The next clip's from my friend Michelle Boland, and in this episode she's talking about movement demands and cross-training. Now, this entire episode is about running, but I think the value and the principles of what she's discussing go far deeper than just being applied to runners. You see, as a strength coach, I think it's really important that we understand the competing commitments that our athletes are under. They have academic stress, social stress, they have sporting stress and physical stress from other things that they're doing. And then on top of that, they have what we're doing, strength and conditioning. And creating a seamless program that combines all of the elements of this and weaves it into a very cohesive program that allows them to recover can be an extreme challenge. And so she talks about her position of how this is fitting in to the context of her program as a whole. So regardless, whether you're into running or not, there's a lot of value in this clip. Please listen.
So you can't do it all. So at the end, like late in my running season, I'm doing so many weekly weekly miles that just takes up a lot of time. So I can't spend, an additional hour a day doing weight training, with my job and family and so on. So one, you need to program it more when you are doing less mileage. So off season, early on in the season, where general fitness is the priority. But then what I like to do is make things less overwhelming and make sure that what we're doing is so targeted that you don't need to do a lot of it. So I program, and I call it, the term, micro dosing. So very short blocks of time, 20 minutes. And we're doing maybe 4 to 6 things that are exactly what you need to be doing for the adaptation that we're trying to make. I call it adaptive upside training, because we're trying to make an adaptation. So there's a purpose, there's an intent with an upside. So we're trying to reduce the negative consequences as much as possible. The upside is in regards to the goal is to improve your running performance. We're not trying to improve your strength training performance. We're using this solely as a tool for your running or hiking performance. And I think that's a huge reframe or misconception of people, because they think, if I'm getting better in the weight room, then I'll just get better everywhere. It's kind of the whole you're weak or you just need to get stronger, right? So it's the reason why we're doing stuff in the weight room is to actually target things that you need for running. There's a lot of factors for trail running that are different from like traditional road running, that are different than, hiking demands, climbing and all that stuff. You pack gear and things like that. Road running, you're hitting the ground a different way, in a different type of ground than you are with trail running. Trail running, there's a lot of agility involved through that. And there's also a lot of movement demands. So when I go to weight train, I'm using resistance or different type of movements to restore access to range of motion. So as opposed to if I was doing like traditional barbell lifts or like Olympic lifts, I know this personally for me, and I'm not saying it applies to everyone, but the next day I would go to do something or run, my legs would be heavy. I would feel so stiff, a lot of tension through my hips. Well, that's negatively impacting my running workout. Whereas now the type of style of people learning maybe a different way, and the way I train now, that actually helps me the next day feel freedom of movement through my hips, feeling like I can push the ground away to push myself forward. So in the time demand that it requires to do that, will not only, like you said, reduce like the stress that running is putting on me, but it's also going to make me feel better for my next running workout or performance.
This next podcast clip is from the episode with my guy James Cerbie. We're talking about raising standards and increasing frequency. Now, I'll leave the details for the clip, but I do want to say this has caused me to step back and make really clear expectations when it comes to my athletes who claim that they want to get to the next level. I'm not saying that athletes have to give up fun, that strength and conditioning has to be the most important thing they do, but I do tell them if you want to make it to that level, you need to conduct yourself as someone who is at that level. They have certain sleep behaviors, they have certain training behaviors, they have certain nutritional behaviors, and if you want to model that and you want to get to that level, you have to start making small sacrifices now. I'm not saying fun is off the table. I'm not saying your life is over. I'm just saying there's a time when you got to make small sacrifices and say no to certain things so that you can say yes to your development long term. James provides some stories and some real world examples that you might be familiar with about people who have just increased the frequency of what they've done and the work they put in that really allowed them to become world class. I encourage you to listen to this clip and the rest of the episode with James because he talks about so many things that are going to allow us to not just be great in one dimension, but how he helps people become great in multiple dimensions of their life, whether it's family, fitness, spirituality, or even with the friendships and brotherhood that you have. Without further ado, here's the clip from the episode with James.
Yeah, I totally agree with those 3 points. I think the other one I would add in there is like if you want to get more out of your life, like the first thing you have to do is raise your standards, right? They're just so important. Like if you think about your athletes as an example, if you have a high school athlete who's like, oh, I want to be a D1 athlete or I want to go play professionally. It's like, okay, great. Like let's look at those people. How do they live their lives? What are they doing? Right? It's like, you have to be the person before you can be the goal. So you have to take on the identity of, oh, okay, like I am a professional athlete. I am a Division I athlete. It's okay, cool. Like how often do they practice? When they do practice, do they go through the motions or they show up with like a lot of intensity and focus? Are they going out drinking on Friday, Saturday nights, Wednesday nights, and then having to like sleep in, or are they like getting up and working? Right. This is like one of those funny stories I think about a lot. So actually, I just like wrote an email that's going to go out next week on this, so it's top of mind for me. If you think about 3 like very high performers, so take Tony Robbins, Kobe Bryant, rest in peace, and Dave Chappelle. Like what do those 3 guys have in common? Well, if you look at what they did early in their career coming up, they increased the frequency and intensity at which they were doing the thing that they needed to do to get better. They didn't act like anyone else. Because they realized, oh, if I act like other people, I'll get the same results as other people. Like Tony Robbins was trying to get started as a public speaker. Like he now sells out 15,000 plus person events multiple times a year, like no qualms, and dude obviously crushes. But like he looked around early on in his career, is like, well, all these other people that are trying to do the public speaking thing, like they speak maybe like once every month or once every like 6 weeks. He's like, I'm gonna go every weekend. So he literally like quadrupled the frequency with which he was getting repetitions. Kobe Bryant like famously talked about how like it was either in high school, some point early in life, he was like, well, I saw everyone else around me like would just go to practice in the afternoons. So I figured if I just woke up earlier and got an extra practice in every day, I could get better literally 2 times faster than everyone else around me because I got 2 times the reps and exposure. And then everyone's like, okay, Dave Chappelle today is obviously he's the GOAT, right? Like it's Dave Chappelle. Go look at like documentaries of him early in his career. He would do 11 stand-up routines in a single night in New York City when he was getting started. Because he's like, I need to learn faster. I need more repetition. I need more exposure. He's like, he wasn't out just being like a slob and just like playing by the status quo. Like that's what an outstanding standard looks like. It's like, oh, what's everyone else doing? Okay, cool. If I do what everyone else is doing, I'm going to get the same results they're getting. You have to figure out a way to be different if you want different results and outcomes. But I really like the story of those 3 because everyone sees successful people as they are today. They don't see what went in behind the scenes to get them to that point. And so like for athletes that are in high school, right, thinking about going to college professionally, it's like you need to like really seriously look at that. And it's hard to do at that age because you're not mature at all. Like, you're not like it's just not. Very few high school kids can have the capacity to think that way, right? But you find some occasionally, and they end up being the ones that are like quite exceptional. But yeah, that was like the one thing I think I would add to what you brought up.
Next up is my buddy Keiran. Not only have we worked together on multiple projects, we've trained with each other, and we've just been connected in numerous ways for the past several years. He is the strength and conditioning coach for Brunswick High School, and if you've ever seen him coach large group, it's an absolute spectacle. The technique across the board is just so clean compared to what I see out there. And so I had to ask him how he's really pulling this off. And Keiran talks about, coaching athletes of various levels because at Brunswick they have some of the, top kids in the nation. And they also have kids that are just required to play a sport every season who may or may not have interest. And so he talks about creating basic shapes and how he's able to make sure that, athletes of a variety of levels are still getting a training outcome that is desirable. You have to listen to this clip.
But I think it's just always knowing where we want to start in terms of like their quote unquote like core position. Like, I think a lot of us have an appreciation for different movement models or, to your point, different biomechanical things. But I think if we can always, for me, what I always come back to is like I think we're talking a lot about different shapes that people can assume. And like, obviously there's different body types. So certain shapes might be easier than others. But I think the easiest place to start to achieve a shape that looks reasonable for whatever you're coaching, whether a goblet squat, push up, chin up, is always coming back to what I call a tall and tight position, what everybody else calls stacked position. Because I feel like 8 out of 10 times, if we can get somebody to understand their pelvic and rib position and just lock it in one on top of the other, you have, at least now you have a chance for your arms and your legs to one, get a little more mobility, express a little more strength and power. And then we can avoid all the annoying, nagging, low back injuries, pinching in my hip, pinching in my shoulder, my neck. So a lot of the times we'll start day one. And I say this day one, besides like the, hey, don't kill yourself, don't drop a weight on your head type stuff, is if you don't remember anything else, there's 3 positions. And shout out to the strength faction guys back in the day. I totally stole this from them, but our macho man position, right? And we always like, make a little joke about it, try to get the kids laughing as soon as we can. And it's just, you got the big tough guy walking down the hallway at you, sticking his chest out, sticking his butt out, and then we have bad dog or sad dog position. Who's got a dog at home? And then you could start, that's another conversation piece because I'm a big dog guy. So we can talk about that later, but what happens when they take a dump on the floor and you yell at them, they get all sad. And now they're in that really flex position, right? Neither one of these positions feels great in. So we want to get tall and tight, head over heart, over hips, feel a little bit of your side abs. And if you don't remember anything else today, remember that. And so we'll just try to hammer that for a while. Some kids they'll hear that all semester and just be like, all right, coach, I get it. But if we could start there, I think and whatever model that you really like and you really base your coach's eye off of, I think that everyone can agree like having control of your middle is a really good place to start for whatever the goal is.
Next up is a clip from my guy, Mike Robertson. Mike is probably the person in the industry who's had the most influence on me. He's been a friend. He's a guy I know that if I reach out to, he's willing to pay it forward. And I appreciate that so much, Mike. And in this episode, he does what he does best. And I think that's take very complex things and make them very simple. Mike's talking about connecting the assessments, what we're seeing, and how he's reverse engineering this in order to give his athletes effective interventions. If you know anything about working with high-level athletes, you know that we've got very little time to actually work with them. These off seasons are short, the seasons are long, and they're often traveling all over the place trying to see family, get vacation in before they're back to the grind. And so you have to be very effective with the choices that you make, with the time that you have with your athletes. And Mike highlights his process, or his thought process, on this so effectively. Listen to the clip here with Mike Robertson.
Yeah. So I think it all starts with really trying to understand the kid, their strengths and weaknesses, honing in on both of those things throughout this process, right? Hey, you're already an amazing finisher, right? You're already an amazing shooter. So like highlighting their strengths and then, okay, this is great. It's just like any sort of evaluation, right? What are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? What are your rate limiters? And so that's what I always try and hone in on is like, hey, look, let's continue to maximize your strengths. That's what makes you who you are. That makes you great. But let's minimize these rate limiters so we can get you more minutes or, get you to the next level. The one thing that I've always tried to do throughout my career is associate and work with people that are on a path of some sort, right? So the person that has no path, no real motivation, they're not going to work well with me. So I just generally don't work with those people. It's like, hey, it's the kid that's in high school and wants to play in college. The guy that's playing in college wants to be a professional. The guy that's a pro that wants a second or third or fourth contract. Those are the people that I work best with. So it starts with, here are your strengths, here are your weaknesses. How can we level those up? How can what I do help improve your weaknesses, right? So maybe it's pure speed. Maybe it's your vertical jump, your power, your explosiveness, your ability to stay on the court. So I start to talk in those terms, right? Hey, you've had this persistent knee issue. Or, hey, you don't have the juice. I have these numbers. You don't have the juice to play at the next level. How can we help you do that? So it starts there with like this discussion and then diving in and really figuring out under the hood what's going on, right? And that's where kind of our assessment process comes in. That's evolved a lot for me personally. I still do the posture photos and all that good stuff. I do some table tests. We do a full, I don't want to even call it a movement screen. It's really just like a on the fly test of what can and can't they do. So I know, hey, day one, this kid can goblet squat. They can front foot elevated split squat. They can do a push up on the ground. And then the final piece is like the force plate type testing. So we can really understand like the machinery and the hardware, what's going on, what do they do well, what do we need to work on from that lens. But that's kind of how we do it, right? It's twofold. It's talking to the athlete, figuring out what they're good at, what they're not good at, trying to tie some context into all this, and then help them understand with the assessment, okay, here's what we found with the assessment. Here's my plan and my vision to help you get to where you want to go.
I think anybody who's on a path can appreciate that, right? Because
I hope so.
I mean, it's like you got to get clarity, I think, not about just where you want to go, but where you're actually starting from, right? So the old analogy is like the roadmap, right? If we're in New York and I'm trying to go to Chicago, I don't want a map that takes me to Miami.
Yeah.
But I'll admit, we still use posture photos. Yeah. We still use like basic movement screens. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and I tell parents, it's like, I know they can dunk. I know they can posterize some kids and that's all great. But like, speed can mask a lot of deficiencies in some cases. And I just want to see how these athletes move in like a low speed, low fatigue, low strength situation. Like, what are they actually showing me?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And one of the things that I find is that whether we're looking at their movement, whether we're looking at their posture photos, we're looking at the performance tests, a lot of times the issues that they have, it's very easy to tie something that we find in our assessment back to their deficiencies. right? So the kid that's always got anterior knee pain. Well, look where your center of gravity is. Look at this twist that you have through your knee. Do you think that could be causing some of this? So whether it's that or the guy that's like, hey, man, my first step is great, but man, I suck at finishing. And you watch a little bit of film and you're like, well, that's because you are all gas pedal and zero brakes, my friend. And then you look at their rebound jump test on a force plate. And you're like, oh, wow, well, your braking absolutely sucks. So here's just another thing that's showing, yes, what you're feeling, I'm seeing. Now let's come up with a plan and a strategy to help move you from A to B. So you've got better brakes, you can become a better finisher. Or, hey, here's the program that we're going to use to untwist your knee, right? Make sure it's more, don't let Bill hear me say this, it's more of a hinge, right? You got to talk their terms. They don't want to hear about a condyloid knee joint. Hey, let's make this more of a hinge, right? Because it's not supposed to have that twist there. So let's untwist it, let it relax. Now, hey, what's cool is you're probably going to jump higher too.
Next up is the clip from Kevin Kirsh. Kevin's a doctor of physical therapy, and in this clip, we're talking about when he lived in Colorado and was a strength and conditioning coach for a high school. He had replaced somebody who was there, and there was precedent for how things ran, what the expectations were, and so he had to come to this program and implement some changes while still preserving the culture that had been built up. So he talks a lot about the programming and delivery of that. There's two sides to this coin that I think are very valuable. I love this episode with Kevin, and I know you're going to love this clip.
Yeah, so I try to have like the big rocks be like, some sort of squat, some sort of pull, or sorry, some sort of hinge, I guess, and then some sort of push. So, usually a version of a bench press, whatever we have available to us. And I just try to put those constraints in there that we're going to do it as quality as possible. So like I was fortunate enough that first year, like, it was a public school, but it was relatively good booster club. So, they put out there, like, what would be the coach at the end of the first season asked me, like, what would you want? And I was like, I would love squat wedges. I would love safety squat bars. They were like, send me some links. We'll see what we can get. And then like the next day I got a text and they're like, cool, we bought 7 of each. And I was like, oh, okay. Well, that was good. Could I have asked to just get paid more? Like that would have been cool too. But, so I was able to put those constraints on the kids where it's like, cool, we're not going to back squat because like that's going to get a little funky sometimes. So like, let's safety bar squat. Let's use the wedges if they need them. If they don't need them, we'll figure that out. And I would usually try to pair that with something. So I would, do a lot of like post activation potentiation. Like, look, you're going to do a set of squats and then you're going to jump, and we had 7 racks. We would usually have like 5 to 7 kids per rack, depending on the attendance of the lift. So like they would just kind of cycle through and we would try to keep them accountable the best we could. And honestly, a lot of that just involved like, coaching dynamic type stuff. Like let's put a senior at each rack to make sure we have stuff, there's someone staying on task and things, and try to split up guys by relative weights that they were doing. So there wasn't a lot of changing of weights to keep people on track. So that would usually be like the first 15, 20 minutes would be like one main lift with one main jump. Depending on level, we might mix in like some, plus plyos type stuff as warm-ups, like just getting them jumping, skipping, doing different things. A lot of that we started like freshman year with them. We would just kind of get in lines and go through some plus plyo stuff because like you watch a 13-year-old try to do like a broad jump sometimes and you see some absolutely insane things. So like that's where we would kind of bring that in as early into the program as possible. And then I would just always do a circuit of accessory work. I was very full body approach. So like we didn't do leg day, on the circuit. I would try to fill in the gaps. So if it was squats, we would do, maybe some single arm pressing, some rows, some hinges there, like more of the single arm stuff, mix in some like core type stuff. And then we would always finish with competition. And the competition would usually be like running based, but maybe with task constraints. So like hop over a hurdle, hop over a box, hold a med ball, stuff like that. We break up into teams. And that was one of the coolest ways to like really keep the guys engaged, because it was like, look, we have this like kind of dangling carrot. We're going to have a fun competition at the end. And then depending on how well they did, that competition may change to, maybe we're doing more like isometric holds or things like that, or, and we did have to get a little bit like disciplinarian sometimes. Like, that's where the other coach was helpful. He's like, we instituted a whistle rule. Like, I had to stand there with my whistle around my neck like a gym teacher. And like, when I blow the whistle, everyone has to get quiet. Like, if you don't get quiet and I blow a second whistle, we're going to do up, down. So like, there was that component. And I do think that's where sometimes younger coaches do struggle with that, is like riding the line between like disciplinarian and a friend. So that's where that's kind of how I structured it. It worked really well. Honestly, they were great kids. Like, it was good buy-in. I think having a really good head coach, like the head coach was a yeller. So like they didn't want to get in trouble with the head coach. So like that was good. So, to have his support and that, kind of a good organization, like that was fun to see.
Next up is a clip from my guy, Mike Lawless. We're talking here about improving the top end in athletes. And said another way, we're really discussing what are the differentiators in a program that are going to allow athletes to actually excel. Many sport coaches would have you believe it's conditioning and fatigue and a number of other things that we as strength and conditioning coaches know really aren't the big separators. So I love his thought process here, and I love the way he discussed the things that are really going to help young athletes get an edge on their competition. Listen to this clip from Mike Lawless.
Yeah. The biggest, and I know, but I worked as a strength and conditioning coach in a high school setting where I had all the varsity sports. Now about a year removed from that, but for 2 years. So coming into a new school as the coach over some of their strength and conditioning, right? But some of the top athletes are also going to private strength coaches. So there's always that dynamic of try not to step on any toes, because there's some strength coaches that are doing great work. There's some that are running through kind of like we talked about. I think we may have been off air, but like a lot of athletes are running through a lot of the same stuff that you can pick out 9 or 10 things movement wise. That's maybe not great, but they're still training. So they're still taking, money out of the bank account. They're still fatigued when they come into me. So trying to adapt to that, one, was challenging. And then you have coaches that are like, when I'm doing high-end power work and speed work with long recoveries on the back end, coaches are like, well, they're not going to be in shape to play their sport. And to me, and I know, we think a lot of the same lines, is if I can get your top end up here, then fatigue-wise, if our top end is higher than a lot of other teams, the other teams are having the same fatigue as my kid. I don't believe I can out-condition 14-year-olds against another team's 14-year-olds. I just don't think, unless we're just not doing anything, sitting on the couch, we're going to get that done. So to me, if I can bring our top end up and have muscular strength, muscular endurance built in the weight room, and really good sprinting mechanics, and bring that top end up, then at the end of a game, it's not aerobic endurance that is making your team tired. It's that they don't have that high of a top end. So, their top end has now come down here.
If anybody has a question about using force plates, they go to Drake Berberet of Hawkin Dynamics. He has a wealth of knowledge, and he's willing to share his insight. This podcast was absolutely amazing. We build on previous podcasts that Drake has done covering some of the basics of force plate technology. But we cover something that I feel is very important for strength coaches to understand. If you're looking at a force plate and a counter movement jump, and you have, say, a baseball player whose primary objective really doesn't have anything to do with jumping, you might be wondering, is this actually valuable for my athlete? Well, in this clip, Drake talks about using vertical jump metrics and the correlations that they have to other performance variables. Give it a listen.
Yeah, I mean, like using intuition and just like kind of some critical thinking, like people for a long time have made assumptions of like certain metrics that probably give you a good proxy to whatever movement we're comparing. But as we get more data collected, get bigger sample sizes, we can start to make like broader claims and have like some actual validity behind it. So there's 2 good examples, and I'm trying to do the same thing with my research for my PhD, like really oriented on basketball and force plate usage. Mm-hmm. But there's 2 good papers that I kind of point to, and I cited both in my paper that's coming out. But Dr. John McMahon has his paper and some other research on there in professional rugby over in the UK. And basically, as they improved their jump momentum on a counter movement jump, as that value went higher, they also improved their sprint momentum as they were sprinting. I think it was 20 meters, which I think is, I'm going to butcher the math here, but it's like 40 plus yards, just a little over 40. So basically, we might need to fact check that, but the yardage, but it's like a 0.7 or 8 relationship between the two. So it's really high. So you can basically make an assumption with the large data set that, hey, if I have this athlete in the weight room and I'm improving their jump momentum, and then I'm also working on their sprint technique, like you don't stop doing any of that stuff, but jump momentum is going up, and this controlled assessment that I can do wherever I have a force plate and I'm traveling with it, I can keep testing it. Values up, they should go sprint faster. So that's one that kind of makes a proxy to something that's like on the field or on the court. Mm-hmm. And we've found that as well, like we do the NFL combine testing, and all their 40 times are public, right? So like we have the force plate data, all the 40 times are public, run a quick correlation, and it's 0.8. It's been 0.8 for 2 years. And that's not a research study, right? But it's like a very controlled point in time where every single person is peaking for that moment. They jump on the place, and then they literally go and do the 40 it's like 45 minutes later. And they're warming up between, so they jump, run the 40, 0.8 correlation. And then another one that's been really cool, and this kind of gets more towards the changes direction stuff. Nico Phillip, he's at Kansas basketball, working with Ramsey there. He was a PhD student, so he's done a lot of work on the force plates with the team. He basically found that athletes that have a higher, within the, I think it's just men's basketball. He did some work with the women's too, but the men's team, they found that athletes that have a higher breaking rate of force development had a higher on-court contribution throughout the whole season. So basically, if your athlete has a higher breaking RFD, you have a higher likelihood to contribute to your team. It's basically what you can take away from that. He had, one team, PhD that I'm running right now, I have 7 Power 5 Division 1 basketball teams, so it's 96 players. And I'll basically put out, I'm trying to look and see if that same thing exists, which is what all research is. Like one person finds something, other people try to replicate it and find the same thing, adds more evidence. So those are things we're looking into, but in short, you can basically say, all right, your braking qualities will give you insight on things out of the field that are decelerating in nature, right? So go to make a cut, change direction. If someone has a really high, if all their braking qualities are good, braking RFT, braking velocities, braking forces, we can talk about the different metrics that we might look at there. But if those are high compared to other people that they're like same age, same sport, same position, there's probably a good chance they're going to put their foot into the ground on the field or the court and beat their defender that doesn't have those same qualities in a controlled counter movement jump.
The podcast with Thomson Remo from Exer-Fly was an absolute stunner. This guy is an incredible wealth of knowledge when it comes to training, and his understanding of the effects of inertial flywheel training on the development of an athlete is clearly second to none. We talk about using it for capacity. We talk about using it for power. We talk about some of the different behaviors of connective tissue and the way the muscle contracts throughout the range of motion. There's so much information in this podcast. It's very, very dense. But first, I encourage you to listen to this clip on maximizing power output and tissue remodeling using inertial flywheel training.
It's exactly like doing a depth jump or a drop jump, except you're able to do more repetitions much more quickly because you don't have to reset and go back up onto the box to fall off of it again. You can just crank out those repetitions and replicate the magnitude of the impact or the impulse or the eccentric power output that you're producing much more quickly and repeatably, and you can control and monitor everything much more closely. We are capable of gathering all these data parameters, so force, velocity, power output, impulse, and about 40 total metrics. So the information's there, and you can make sure that you're monitoring that closely so you know exactly how much stress to provide, whether it's using the flywheel on its own or adding that additional accentuated eccentric component. we can make sure that we time the training and target the training perfectly to match the demands of what you're trying to accomplish. Now, with Watt Bike, my big responsibility was force velocity profiling and showing teams how to develop those force velocity profiles over a variety of different working durations. So everything from very short sprints to longer, more aerobic dominant tests like a VO2 max test. But with cycling, it's 100% concentric. So you're always pushing on the pedals. It's a 360-degree continuous concentric cycle. Whereas with flywheel training, there is obviously an eccentric and a reversal component. But in America, people tend to refer to the term power as a physical quality. So they refer to something that you develop. So we say we want to work on strength, we want to work on speed, or we want to work on power. But the reality of the situation is power is a metric, and it's measured in watts. And it's something that can be measured whether you're working on strength, or you're working on speed, or you're working on power as a quality on its own. And when they say power as a quality on its own, it's basically the range or the perfect combination of forces and velocities that allow you to produce the best output in watts. So even when you're going heavy, so let's say you're lifting a heavy barbell or working with real heavy inertial loads, you can still quantify power. When you're working on speed, or when you're working with really light weights or light inertial loads, or even just doing plyometrics and ballistics, you can still measure power in watts. Now, you can work everywhere in the middle, obviously, and that's where, it might be your hypertrophy work or just moderate load work focused on development of power in the more pure sense, with fewer repetitions. Those are all things that you can compare to each other. So you can compare your power output at a light inertial load and a high velocity. You can compare your power output to a heavier inertial load with a lower velocity and compare it to whatever's in the middle and see where the athlete is producing his or her best power output, and then make decisions in training based off of that. So if you have a strength dominant athlete who obviously lacks speed, if that's where they tested most poorly when they were completing the force velocity profile, obviously that's a direction you want to trend in, especially if the athlete's sport is a faster paced sport. Conversely, if you're working with, let's say, a power lifter or a strongman, I heard you mention that you were competing in a bunch of strongman during your session with Lee Taft. So if you're competing in events like that where strength is more of the emphasis, obviously you can trend the train in that direction and make sure that as you continue to increase your strength, your power output is continuing to improve as well. Because a lot of coaches will often ask, how strong is strong enough? And it seems like these days more coaches say, well, there is a definitive limit of strength that you need for each sport. And then it's, just maintaining whatever qualities you have from there and keeping the athlete healthy. When the reality of it is you probably can continue to develop your strength indefinitely as long as your power output is continuing to improve within those other qualities as well. So within the power velocity realm and the speed velocity realm. So it's never too late to continue trying to get strong. You just want to make sure that you're smart about it, and then you make sure you're not sacrificing other physical qualities at the expense of it.
Next up is my guy Sam Miller. Sam is a visionary and the man behind the Proteus motion. This is literally a 3D force plate. The amount of data and metrics that you can track using this device is unlike any piece of equipment I've ever used. It's been a profound change for our rotational power in athletes, and that's what Sam and I are jamming on in this next clip. Whether or not you have a Proteus shouldn't prohibit you from listening to this. I think it's important to understand rotational power and some of the metrics behind that and how he's thinking about developing that in athletes long term.
What Proteus kind of allows you to do, though, is understanding the relationship, for example, between power and acceleration. We have, as you've seen in our performance testing, we have for some of our standardized tests, we have a feature called insights and recommendations. And insights, what it does is it looks at the relationship between power and acceleration for a particular movement. And based on the relationship between the two, we put you into a classification. And I'll give you an example. So if, for example, you are doing a trunk rotation and straight arm trunk rotation, and you are in the low, basically, 49th percentile or below for your cohort, no matter the relationship between power and acceleration, we are going to put you into a category which says like, not just are you power deficient, you actually are strength deficient. And therefore you need to be training at basically a velocity range that is lower than, for example, if you were power dominant or speed dominant and at a higher load, right? And then, but beyond that, though, the question is like, all right, well, if you have a power that is significantly greater than your acceleration, right? Acceleration is where you need to be training, right? You need to be training at, 1.25 meters per second or higher, which is going to mean, you're going to be doing more explosive movements, much higher speed and a lighter load, which is going to be a totally different type of training or resistance training tool that you might use or select for that particular movement. And I think one of the things that, to put this into better context too, is if you look at like, we like to say that we've built the world's first and only database for total body and functional and rotational physical strength and power. And we've done these macro data analyses on this, and we're putting out a kind of a state of power report within the next month. And some of the things that we found are really, really powerful. And a couple of these examples would be that we talk about, all right, so we think intuitively that people are overtraining the sagittal plane. The data that we have basically proven that sagittal plane movements, right? Those are the ones that no matter what demographic you look at, but particularly for high school and college athletes, sagittal plane movements are in need of strength the least compared to other movements. So those are, right? So those are, if there are any movements that are, that require a focus of strength training, sagittal plane movements require them the least, right? That is a proven, and we've done the same analysis about a year and a half ago. The exact same thing was proven, and now we've just got a significantly bigger data set. And then beyond that, you start to think about, all right, well then, what are the differences between high school and college? And in some cases, actually, college skill level, especially on the baseball side, there are certain movements that are less deficient than pro. And the biggest gap between on the power and acceleration side lies between the high school and college skill level. And we see all these really, really interesting relationships that basically show you things like 40% of baseball players are power dominant in trunk rotation, even though acceleration is more correlative to performance, right? And we've kind of established this, and Ryan, you and I were just talking about this, the research that's coming out on this, which means that 40% of baseball players actually for trunk rotation they're deficient in acceleration. And there's a huge opportunity there to focus on acceleration with some of those explosive movements. But how would you know, that's a significant portion of baseball players, but how would you know, which of those players need that particular type of training, right? And what body areas? This is what kind of reveals all that for you.
Next up is world-class speed expert Lee Taft. Lee probably has one of the most developed eyes when it comes to assessing speed in real time. And in this episode, we talk about numerous change of direction tactics, top-end speed, and evasive maneuvers, especially for athletes who have to create separation in small spaces. But listen to this clip with Lee talking about the evaluation of athletic speed.
Yes. So there's other things, but the three primary things I always look at when I'm evaluating an athlete, and they're not moving super efficiently. So in the first case, this young lady, the three things we look at is it a skill acquisition issue? Like, does she just not know how to do the skill? Probably not. But she understands change of direction. That's not the issue. Is it a biomechanical issue? Well, could be. Or is it a strength power issue? And we would probably say, yeah. So she might not be hitting the biomechanical position simply because she doesn't have the strength to do so. So one of our first things that we want to do is implement a strength program, and that's going to take time, but if we start doing things to neurologically make her very effective and very efficient, almost potentiated, we can really quickly change that. Sometimes in one session, make her better. So it could be doing things like a band-resisted acceleration out of the change of direction posture you want. Put them in that position, load them, get multiple reps at this higher impulse rate because they have to push harder into the ground because you got this band. Do it. Get all those motor units turned on, get everything firing. Try to get it in a sequence where they're getting great extension from dorsiflexion, knee extension, hip extension, spine extension out of the cup. Rep it. Just like we would low box stuff. Keep doing it. And then have them go live again. I have had multiple athletes instantly change and look like all of a sudden they gained all their strength. Well, they didn't. All they did was become much more coordinated in that moment. And we did that by potentiating them and getting them more, CNS wise turned on, right? So we can do that, but then we got to get them stronger. We just got to keep working, make sure they have adequate quad strength to be able to manage the deceleration. Adequate hamstring and hip strength to be able to handle extra rotation and stuff like that. And then really, really good lower leg foot strength, Achilles, soleus, all that stuff has to be really good so they can, get in and out of cuts. And then obviously the upper body is really important. Get them strong there.
Yep.
Take the other athlete. Do you have any comments on that first athlete?
No, that's fantastic.
Good. Okay. Now the other athlete, obviously, strength isn't an issue. Skill acquisition, probably not. If they're an athlete, they probably know the drill, change of direction. That's not the issue. But like biomechanically, they're struggling because maybe they lack not necessarily skill acquisition, but the programming of a fluid pattern. Like they're just stiff and they're tight and they're not well coordinated because they haven't worked that. They've worked a lot of force production, different ranges of motion that just trying to increase range, or their power, their strength in the weight room, but they haven't been as dynamic. So for that athlete, we'll start doing things such as 180 runs. We'll do the 7 patterns. What we're trying to do is quickly supersede their desire to produce high levels of force with body awareness and spatial awareness exercises that start to free up their movement capacities, give them range of motion. Obviously, we're going to work on range of motion, stretching and stuff like that. But once you start to unleash their ability to have body and spatial awareness, now they can get back into a coordinated pattern of getting into those cuts and out of it. Got to make sure they can regain ankle range of motion, hip range of motion, free their ribs up to be able to get in and out of plants and cuts and turn in and out of them really well, stuff like that. But I'm really big on if I can get them moving again. Like I said, I love 180s because that's a dissociative type drill. All the 7 patterns of acceleration, sprinting, lateral shuffle, all that stuff really starts to free them up. So those are the ways that.
Next up is James Fryer. This episode really caused me to step back and reevaluate how much soft tissue work I was doing with myself and with my athletes. The methods that we were using, the density of the foam rollers that we were using. It's worth listening to this entire episode. But in this specifically, James is talking about why he's using softer foam rollers these days and how some of these changes are actually helping his athletes start to move better and feel better. Listen to this clip with James Fryer.
I think that I agree though 100%, is that I've come back to using more foam rollers or using a ball. Usually I still use softer tools now than I would have before. Like I would use a hard foam roller, get spikes on foam rollers and like dig in there, right? Yeah, or like the hard lacrosse ball. So now I tend to move towards softer foam rollers. I tend to move towards like practice lacrosse balls or kid practice lacrosse balls because they're actually squishy, so they don't break out all the windows in the building when they're playing inside in the winter. So I use these little bit softer tools because most people can't allow for that motion to happen if they're having pain still. So like if the foam roller hurts, they're squeezing and bracing. Or if the lacrosse ball hurts their foot, because most people's feet are very sensitive, initially at least, is that they can't let go of foot tension still when we're massaging it. And that's kind of where you'll see a lot of massage therapists just rail people. And, they think that they're making more progress that way. But people need to be able to let go of some of these tension patterns they're holding. And I think that's where I can teach them as well as a manual therapist to like, oh, okay, I need you to let go of tension as we're moving your arm or moving your rib cage, where they're still having that tendency with their laying on a foam roller to maybe hold some of that protective tension going on there. So I think I can kind of calibrate how much tension they're holding, and they might not even realize it. Like a lot of times I have to tell people like, okay, let go of tension again. They're like, I did. I'm like, no, you're not. Like, and they're like, oh, like there is another level of like holding on that they don't realize is happening. So I think that's a big piece of it, is like feeling what letting go really feels like. And then just regulating pressure more and more for them. And just allowing them to breathe and get comfortable, change their nervous system in those positions, I think is another tool that I love to add in to help people feel that change in their rib cage or their scapula. Like, because you can actually feel those differences by going through breathing cycles while I'm doing the hands-on tissue work versus just gritting and holding their breath because it hurts so bad. I think those are some of the main things. I think there is some placebo to the value people place in somebody putting their hands on them and working on them versus you telling them to do it to themselves with a foam roller. I think it's unrealistic to assume there's not some placebo effect involved there. But I'll take that any day of the week if they're allowing me to work on them, they're seeing progress that they weren't able to capture on their own before. So I'm not negligent in that sense. Like it's just part of the process. If people value that and they think it's going to work, they're gonna move towards that. And I think that's part of like seeing the light that we talked about, is like people have to have a little bit of confidence in the thing that they're doing is going to make them better. Whether that's fitness, like if somebody hates fitness and they think it's stupid and it's not going to help them, like there's a certain level of like that creates a little bit of a barrier for them to work and focus the way they need to on exercises and things like that.
The episode with Ryan Connor was very fun to do. One of my favorite topics these days is to jam on speed. And there are numerous influences out there, often with competing ideologies, or at least that's the way they frame it on social media. But Ryan's a guy who really understands how to bring all this together into a clean, cohesive, and comprehensive program to develop athletic speed for his athletes. Listen to this clip on marrying technique and physical development in the development of youth athletes.
Yeah, I think kind of what I hit on really early on with the technical side and the physical side kind of needing to be married up a little bit. I think that's a big deal, especially around here. It just seems like there's only one or the other, like I was saying. And a combination of things is really what's required to get people where they want to be. So I think that's a big piece of it. And then within the technique side of things, just simple coordination and simple timing is a big deal for sprint performance. And I think that kind of gets overlooked for some of the fancier things sometimes. I made a post a couple of days ago, I guess it was maybe last week, about things that we've kind of taken out of the program. Like some more resisted sprinting. We've kind of taken away a little bit from, especially the younger athletes, for sure. They just don't need it. But even all of our athletes have benefited from less resisted sprinting because they're not really necessarily good enough at sprinting to really need to load that thing, just like any other movement, squatting, you name the strength exercise, right? So I think sometimes we try to look too much from a strength lens at speed. So that's definitely something that I see. And just general strength training is going to do enough for those people that lack force production. If you feel like an athlete might need to run under resistance, maybe they just need to continue the process of getting stronger and working on the other side of the coin, which is just running full speed and having some exposure to that. I'm amazed by a lot of the athletes that come in and just don't even run full speed at practice anymore, things like that. They're just kind of doing drills and then walking around talking with coaches or doing things that are skill related but not even that fast. So just getting more exposure. If we work with team sports, getting more exposure to sprinting goes a really long way. And then just in terms of our industry, I think it's leveled up a lot over the past couple of years. Like there's a lot of science behind everything, but I think we need to apply that science in a way that matters for our people. I know I get caught up in trying to learn every little thing I can. But if it's really not something that I can apply to my athletes, is it really that important to learn? Is it really that important to spend time on? So I know that's something that I've personally been more aware of recently. And I just think we could all get a little more aware of what we're learning and why we're learning it.
Next up is a clip from Kyle Dobbs. Kyle is one of the most pragmatic coaches out there. He understands the big picture. He's very, very intelligent, but he programs in such a simple way that it's hard not to be attracted to his work. In this clip, we actually get kind of into the woods. We talk a little bit about Jacksonian dissolution, and I'll leave it to the clip to let Kyle explain to you exactly what that is. But at the simple level, we're talking about how stress applied to our athletes can impact their performance. And we talk throughout the episode about watching your athletes play and what you're actually seeing. And so I think this is a great episode to kind of give you a primer on what we're talking about. And I encourage you to go back and listen to this entire episode because there's some aha moments that seem almost incredibly obvious when you listen to it. But Kyle is phenomenal, and I know you're going to love this little clip.
Yeah, I mean, the easiest way that I explain it to most people is, any system, right? And a system can be an individual organism, or it can be, it can be an organization, right? Like from a company perspective, like it can be almost anything. It can be the banking system if we want it to. But, when we start looking at the more stress we add to this system, the more complexity we start stripping back. So the things that were, added on later to the system, the things it's grown to be, we kind of revert back to these very simple primal forms of it, right? The initial foundational elements. And what you're really looking at is, again, it's almost a homeostatic mechanism, right? Where it's like complexity requires more energy. And if you're already being, bombasted with stress, you're losing at that point, just resources altogether. So it's like your body's like, oh shit, like we need to start dropping some of this, skill acquisition or whatever. Like you said, even some of the things that you learned through, gaining a new belt, right? And you go back to that day one guy who's like kind of scared in his gi and like trapped, right? It's like you see basketball players all the time. It's the same thing. It's like, you've been working on jump shot mechanics. You've been working on your left hand. You've been working on new plays to run, right? To counter different, zone schemes or whatever. And you see these things fall apart as teams get tired or as teams get stressed, right? And that's where sports is, I think, such a game of just like runs in a lot of ways in a game, right? Where it's like when you're doing really well, you're up, things start shots start falling, plays start working, right? Like two things are happening. You're getting this positive reinforcement. You're less stressed. You're winning. And the other team is seemingly also falling apart. At teams. Like they're missing help side defense. They're throwing the ball away just straight out of bounds. They're not running plays. They're missing shots. And it's a game, and it's a game just completely built on, runs and kind of just teams like capitalizing on repeat opportunities, right? And I think when you look at this model of like Jacksonian dissolution, right, you just, as stress builds, complexity gets stripped away, and it's like you revert back to kind of the worst form of yourself sometimes, right? Maybe not all the way down all the time, but But it's like you even look at this with like energy system, work, right? And I think that's where, like substrate utilization will decrease over time as you're going, right? So it's just like fatigue, environmental stress, internal, intrinsic stress, right? Any kind of stress is slowly going to decrease complexity, right? And we can look at this with exercise selections, right? The exercises that we have the opportunity for the highest physiological outputs in are typically the least complex or the simplest forms, right? They're the most constrained. And then as we add complexity, right, we decrease the amount of stress we can the amount of outputs we can actually generate through them, right? Again, that might even be as simple as going from a bilateral exercise into a unilateral exercise. It might be proprioceptive. It might just be more skill acquisition. And again, that's subjective because, obviously the more you do something, the less novel it becomes, the more familiar it becomes. But that's where, like you're saying, if you go to another JITS tournament this year and you run into the same environment after a whole nother year of practicing, you're probably not going to revert back in the same way as you get under stress, right? And so it's hard to define these things with athletes because it's a moving target and it's ever evolving, right? Because exposures matter, because exposures decrease novelty and increase familiarity. Your brain is all of a sudden building better models based on more positive experiences and connotations and results. Like you said, you keep getting crossed over. At some point, you're going to be able to counteract that, right? Or you're going to quit basketball. It's one of the two things, right? And this is even, branching it out further. It's like talking to a lot of other coaches. And this is actually a conversation I had with Jared Boyd a few years ago, who works with the Grizzlies. And it's like everybody on an NBA basketball team is a freak athlete. All of them. Even the ones you don't think are athletic. Marc Gasol would put us to shame on a lot of things, right? And it's just like the best athletes also assimilate information and new skills the fastest. It's like when we're teaching new athletes either something on a basketball court or new exercise in a weight room, you'll see some guys that they do it one time and they do it perfect. They'll watch it, they'll do it. It's like you've worked with NFL guys, you've worked with college guys, high school guys. It's like you've got people that like they can see it and process it, assimilate it, and actually just reproduce it immediately, 1 to 2 reps. And then you'll have some people where it takes longer. And it's like that person that takes longer might have a higher standing vertical. But it doesn't matter if they can't process the information as quickly and make it as repeatable. And I think that's where a lot of people who have never worked with high level athletes also don't understand that aspect of it. But even in the Gen Pop realm, like you learn really quickly with your clients, like who's better at skill acquisition really early on in the frame. It's like you'll have clients where you got to explain a single leg RDL for 5 years. And you've got some people who they do it 2 or 3 times and it's like they know it. And then you can start progressing it.
Next up is Spencer Medick. Spencer's part of the talent identification and player development for the New York Yankees. My biggest takeaway from this episode was how there's an appreciation for nuance in terms of what each athlete's strengths are when they come into the program. You see, at this level, everyone is elite. Everyone has exceptional capabilities. Yet through their assessments, they're able to identify what the small leverage points are going to be that allow athletes to make the biggest improvement. So there's no need to overhaul, but instead really play to their strengths while bringing up their weaknesses. Listen to this clip on talent identification in Major League Baseball athletes.
For sure. So we typically, when we draft or sign a player, acquire them, it's for a good reason, right? They're already pretty good. So we don't immediately bring them in and say like, hey, let's change a bunch of stuff. We try to start with results at the plate. If you think about, your favorite big league team, you got a whole swath of different players, different sizes, pitch shapes, everything. They all look completely different, but they're all successful in some nature to become, the 1% of the 1% to play in the big leagues. So we try to essentially just identify from a skill level. We have a motion capture lab. We have, pitch tracking data, high speed cameras, all these things to identify, okay, what do they do really, really, really well? Like what made them good enough for us to want to acquire them first, right? And then we look for, okay, where are some areas of improvement? Where maybe some areas that are currently keeping them from being in the big leagues right now? And then on the physical preparation side, we also have force plates, we have Proteus, we have, movement assessments. Our medical team will kind of evaluate everything, and they'll do the same process, right? They'll say, all right, where is this guy a superstar? And then where are some areas of improvement where we can maybe build a bigger engine, maybe we can fill that missing bucket. Maybe they're just like a super strong athlete. We draft a college kid who, was an absolute grinder for 4 years in college and a monster in the weight room, and he was just bigger and stronger than everyone else in college. But now that the playing field's a little more level, hey, maybe we really need to shift more towards power. That's where, okay, maybe their focus becomes more on acceleration. We know that their strength profile is good enough. It's about acceleration. How quickly can you produce that force? Now that average velocity from college has maybe gone from 89, 90 to, all right, now you're seeing 94, 95 on a regular basis. Do you have the skill to make those decisions and put a bat to a barrel, or put a ball to a barrel? Or are you just lacking the actual skill to, you can make the decision, but you're not quick enough. You're just strong enough to muscle everything out. But now you actually have to train some quickness and some more explosiveness. So that's kind of how we look at everything. And then it kind of always starts with what is the path to you getting to the big leagues, and then working back from there. We typically try to start with results first, right? Because at the end of the day, you see all these funky guys like Darren O'Day, perfect example. I grew up in Baltimore, was a big Orioles fan, had a low slot, didn't throw very hard, funky delivery, but was like one of the greatest relievers in the game for a stretch, just because he was unique. He did things differently. And if somebody saw him throw that, it's like, that guy's like, he was a walk-on at Florida. Mm-hmm. Everyone undervalued him for so long. And then he becomes, for a 5 to 7 year stretch, probably one of the most dominant relievers in the game. So it's, everyone kind of has their own path, their own profile. We just look for, leaning into the strengths, and then also try to fill those missing buckets and really maximize their performance. We don't want to change who they are.
Next up is my guy, Mickey Brueckner. When Mickey talks about baseball, I listen. This guy not only understands it because he played baseball at a very high level, he's coached athletes at the highest level of baseball and just understands it better than virtually anybody I know. In this clip, we're talking about the kinematic sequence and building movement literacy in young throwers. I think this entire episode was a slam dunk, but listen to this little nugget from Mickey now.
Movement. That's the first thing, right? Because I think no amount of scapular stability or glenohumeral stability is going to outlast somebody who moves like crap. I think at the end of the day, the most important thing is moving well and having a good, efficient, kinematic sequence, right? If you can do those things, I think that's low-hanging fruit for most athletes. So for me, I used to do a lot more arm care with top to bottom, high level, low level throwers. I don't focus as much now with the low level throwers on your quote unquote cuff and scap work. Now we still do it, but we don't do it as religiously with our super young athletes. For me, I'm focusing more on hey, do you move well? Can you move proximal to distal? Do you have good reciprocal movement patterns? Can you push? Can you pull? Can your scapula drive the movement of your humerus, right? Can you dissociate your upper body? Do you have a good, subjectively speaking, do you have a good, solid, kinematic sequence, right? Does your pelvis lead your trunk? Does your trunk lead your scap to your upper arm? Does your arm lead your hand? Is all that stuff clean, right? If we can check all those things off, oftentimes, great. Now, you're probably starting to throw pretty hard at that point. You're probably, if you can sequence your delivery really well, you're probably throwing on the upper side from the velocity standpoint. So at that point, yes, we do need to start focusing on cuff strength, scap strength, neuromuscular timing, and glenohumeral stability, and all those things working and moving, congruently together. But again, movement, if they're lacking that, go there first. But as far as like, once you start becoming a more advanced thrower, now you're playing the same sport, like you're a starter, you're logging a lot of innings, then I think, as velocity goes up, then the need for your quote unquote arm care work does become more important. So I think just understanding where the athlete is in their evolution and their development is going to really dictate how much of that stuff we're focusing on. And I think, to be honest, like some of those businesses that you mentioned, like I think they do a great job in terms of improving performance. To me, arm care is less about performance. It's about creating longevity, right? Because if you look at any athlete in their evolution, if they can stay healthy, they're just going to reap the compounding effects of development, right? But as soon, in my case included, like as soon as you get injured, you revert back. Like you have to start all over again. So I think the best thing we can do in terms of helping these kids' development, number one thing, most important thing is keep them healthy, right? Because if you look at every velocity study across the board, there's only one metric that is always in every study positively affecting velocity, and that's age. That's it. It's the only one that has every single time it has a positive effect. So if we can just over time keep them healthy and give them what they need in order to stay healthy. And to me, arm care is, again, it's also load management, getting them to understand like when are they doing their arm care, how much of it they're doing, like managing their throwing programs, their volume, all that stuff. And that takes time. And it takes an athlete who's mature enough to understand like, look, sometimes more is not always more. I need to ride the ebbs and flows of the competitive year and make sure I'm like, there's parts of the year where I'm focusing on development, right? In the weight room, in the gym. And then there's parts of the year where I'm focusing on developing as a pitcher. And I think there's got to be a dichotomy there. It can't just all be all things all the time. And I think that's where kids generally get into trouble with just developing velocity and arm care. So
if you enjoyed this episode, please remember to rate and review us with 5 stars only, then subscribe so you can get all the latest updates.